All right, thank you to William for the reading, and thank you to Malka for the Lord's Supper. Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be here and to share this lesson about duty and gratefulness. And I think it's a very timely lesson, I believe, in this day and age. And it partly will continue on from what Malachi has mentioned in the Lord's Supper and giving. So just, I won't read this again. William has already read it. I think this is a familiar story to us all. And as I was preparing this lesson, I realized that it's quite interesting because Luke was known as a physician. And if you read that book, you will realize that he's a lot more precise in his descriptions of all the people that Jesus healed. And his emphasis really was on on using healing as a physical manifestation of spiritual well-being. And that's a thought I hope we can look at a bit more today. So before we go on in detail, let's look at, as a doctor myself, I guess I empathize with Luke, but let's look at what is leprosy. Okay, the Bible talks about leprosy a lot, and thankfully we don't see much of it today. And this was kind of cured by the grace of God, really, with the development of antibiotics. So that's obviously people losing their fingers. That's facial deformity from leprosy. So we are blessed that we don't see too much of it anymore. This is a more basic manifestation. It's actually like depigmentation or polypigmented skin, and it's associated with loss of sensation. It's caused by a bacterium, which is in the same family as the bacterium causing TB. Okay, so just although we've kind of more or less controlled or cured leprosy, because leprosy is not very infectious. No matter what they said in the old days, where they ostracized them and put them in an encampment far away in a colony of sorts, it was never very infectious. So once they developed antibiotics for it, you basically could more or less cure it quite well. I mean, there is still leprosy in the world today, but it's not a very common thing. Unlike smallpox, which is very infectious, it killed a lot of people, that's more or less eradicated. There is leprosy, but it is treatable now. And the main complication of leprosy is the loss of sensation. And now we'll go on to that in a minute. But the Bible does have many examples of leprosy. Moses, when he was in front of the burning bush, he tested God by putting his hand in the cloak, and God gave him leprosy for a minute, and then was leprous like snow, and then he healed him to show God's power over the human body. And likewise, when Aaron and Miriam were rebelling against Moses, if you remember that story, Miriam, I don't know what Aaron was it, but Miriam was inflicted with leprosy, and Moses and Aaron had to pray for her healing. Okay, and then that famous story we've covered a few times, I think, over the last couple of years, was the general Naaman, the Syrian general, had leprosy, and he had to find a cure. He went to see Elisha, and he was asked to dip in the River Jordan 7 times for healing. So if you think about it, you would think, oh, if someone doesn't feel any pain, that's a great thing, isn't it? Numbness, lack of pain is a blessing, but rather it's actually a curse, because pain is what leads you to protect yourself. Okay, so pain leads to people seeking a cure, whereas leprosy, you lose your feeling, and numbness to pain can lead to significant damage. One of the great complications, significant complications or problems with diabetes, for example, is you lose your feeling in your nerves, and you can get bad injuries, particularly to the extremities, so your feet in particular. And in a spiritual way, there is a lot of numbness in the world today to sin, and that actually leads to great spiritual damage. And that is the message that Jesus was sending, and that Luke was chronicling when he was talking about all those incidences of healing. So the context, if you turn to Luke 17, I didn't put all the passages in there, but if you look at Luke 17, if you want to understand where it's coming from, you kind of have to see where it was, what he was talking about. So the first 4 verses in that passage, he described about millstone hung around your neck if you caused someone to sin. Okay, and then he told them to forgive those who sin against you. All right, that was in verse 4. And then straight after that, the apostles realized that this is a tough task. And they said, give us more faith. And then he said, you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can ask the tree to jump into the sea and it will obey you. And that shows the power of faith. And then in 7 to 10, that's an interesting one. We won't go into that in detail, but it talks about the job of the role of a servant and your duty and not receiving any extra credit if you do your duty. And straight after that, he comes on his journey into Jerusalem. And as he went there, he passed by a village and he was met by 10 lepers who stood at a distance. So in this story, it starts off with people separated by a distance due to their disease. And you can clearly see the similarity to all of us separated from God by a distance. Okay, we are separated by our illness of sin, which leads to death. So just as leprosy led to death, our spiritual sin leads to death. And it consisted of Jews and Samaritans. So the same as we are today. Okay. And they were actually, interestingly, together only due to their affliction, because Jews and Samaritans never mixed. But when they're sick, misery loves company, let's chuck them all together. And that's all fine. And so that's the beginning of the story. And we are spiritually separated from God before we are forgiven. So the moment Jesus saw them, he said, go and show yourselves to the priest. Because to be certified clean, according to Leviticus 14:2, you need a certificate of that you have been cured. Because in those days, I guess there wasn't any real cure, and so they need a physical inspection to prove that they were cured. And it's interesting that, try and imagine it this way, right? Like they had no feeling in various bits of their body. And as they went to the temple, they suddenly realized that they could feel again, right? They could feel their feet or feel their hands or whatever part that's involved. And it must be a very shocking thing. Like you would think that you are just going to die like this, but they were revived. They had their feeling back again. And so you can imagine that they would all be running to the temple to get proof that they were healed. But one of them, when he realized he was healed, turned back and praised God with a loud voice and fell on his face at Jesus' feet, giving him thanks. And he was a Samaritan. So only one out of the 10 returned to thank God, to thank Jesus. Malachi made a point. You feed the homeless now, and you make their week maybe. But it's interesting. And it is true that Jesus did say, to give without expecting anything in return. But the onus really is on the receiver, right? Why do they not turn? Why do they not feel any gratitude or thankfulness? Why do they not take responsibility to perhaps aim to try and repay or to do what someone else has done for them? And that is a real question. Like the foundation of Western civilization, actually, it has never been on expecting others to just keep giving. It has always been on the expectation that people take up the responsibility to give. Okay, and without that mentality, our civilization will eventually collapse. Because when everyone's a receiver and no one's returning to give thanks to God, that's when you lead to the great flood, right? I think that's the ultimate outcome. And that was the question Jesus asked. We're not 10 cleansed. Where are the 9? And that is the question all of us have to face today. Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner? So he said, rise and go your way. Your faith has made you well. Something to reflect, different root words, okay? When he said cleanse, we're not 10 cleansed. So cleanse comes from the word katharizo, which is catharsis. That's the English word, which means to make clean. And then he finishes with verse 19, rise and go your way, your faith has made you well or whole. Okay? And that is the Greek word sozo, to make whole or to save. And in Luke 19:10, Son of Man came to seek and to save. That's the same word, sozo, the lost, to make whole the lost. The goal of our duty and our life really is to move beyond the numbness where you think God owes me something. He owes me for things, to be overwhelmed by the grace of God, by gratitude, and then it leads to reciprocity, to freely receive and to freely give. And Christians today, we are always reminded to be, that's why you look in the writings of Paul, he understood this because he knew the depths to which he had sunk. He had been a murderer, he had been a persecutor of the Christians, and yet God had saved him, had shown him the right path. And so he turned around and made a difference. And so that is the question, I guess, for us and always, right? Are we grateful for what people do for us? Are we thankful? They did a study once, and if people at a crossing acknowledges the car stopping for them, they are generally happier and more grateful than those who just walk and ignore the car stopping for them. I thought that's an interesting observation. So just think about it yourself. Do you give thanks to the car driver who stops as you cross the road? And that's the attitude we should inculcate as Christians. To always be thankful for all the things that God has given to us. Are we this one who turn back on the 9, just taking everything for granted and ignoring all the blessings that God has given us? Or if each one of us helps one another, do we always seek to take responsibility and contribute more to then give to others in return? And not just be a taker, but be a giver. So I leave that thought in your mind, and thank you for your attention.